Picture this. It's May 1945, and you're standing on the flight deck of USS Enterprise in the Pacific. The Air Boss just launched 30 Hellcats and Dauntless dive bombers for a strike on Japanese positions. They'll be back in 2 hours, low on fuel, some shot up, pilots exhausted. And here's the problem that's about to kill some of them. Your flight deck is a 872-foot-long parking lot with exactly one way in and one way out. Every carrier in World War II operated like a deadly game of musical chairs. When planes returned from missions, they had to land one at a time on the stern, catch an arresting wire, then immediately taxi forward to park near the bow. Sounds simple, right? Except each landing took about 90 seconds, and you had 30 planes circling overhead with maybe 20 minutes of fuel left. Do the math. That's 45 minutes of recovery time for 30 aircraft. The last planes in the pattern were landing on fumes, and if one pilot missed the wires and crashed, everything stopped. The deck crew had to push the wreckage overboard while 29 other pilots burned precious fuel circles in the sky, watching their gauges drop toward empty. But the real nightmare wasn't the recovery time, it was what happened after. Once all your planes were back aboard, they sat parked wingtip to wingtip from bow to stern, fully armed and fueled. The flight deck looked like a crowded parking garage filled with bombs and aviation gas. Want to launch another strike? You couldn't. Not until deck crews manhandled every single aircraft around, respotting them for launch, which took another hour. The carrier was essentially useless for 60 to 90 minutes after recovering aircraft. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58 in 1944, called this the deck cycle problem, and it was strangling American naval air power. His carriers could theoretically operate 100 aircraft each, but the straight deck geometry meant he could only launch one major strike per day. The Japanese had the same problem. Their carriers at Midway in June 1942 were caught with planes parked everywhere, unable to launch or land, when American dive bombers arrived. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu went down because their decks were frozen, trapped in the recovery, respot, rearm cycle. Here's what really kept admirals awake at night. Carriers were supposed to be the new capital ships, replacing battleships as the backbone of naval power. But battleships could fire their guns continuously in combat. A carrier launching one strike every 6 hours? That wasn't a weapon. That was a very expensive sitting duck. The U.S. Navy calculated that in a theoretical battle against the Soviet Navy in the late 1940s, American carriers would get exactly one strike before enemy submarines and surface ships closed the range. One punch, then you're in a knife fight with an empty gun. The straight deck design wasn't anyone's fault. It was just how every Navy built carriers from the 1920s onward. You needed a long, clear runway pointing into the wind for launch and recovery. Nobody questioned it because nobody had a better idea. Until the bodies started stacking up and admirals started counting how many pilots they were losing, not to enemy fire, but to fuel starvation while waiting to land on their own ships. December 7, 1941, changed everything about how navies thought about carrier warfare, but not in the way most people remember. Yes, Pearl Harbor proved carriers could project devastating power. Japanese strike aircraft crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet in 2 hours. But what happened after the attack revealed the fatal weakness everyone had been ignoring. Admiral Nagumo's 6 carriers had launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves starting at 6 a.m. By 10 a.m., when the last planes returned, his decks were so clogged with recovering aircraft that he couldn't launch a third strike against Pearl's oil storage tanks and repair facilities. His staff needed 3 hours to clear the decks, rearm, and respot for another launch. 3 hours that would have left his task force vulnerable to American counterattack if any U.S. carriers had been in port. Nagumo turned for home, leaving the job half-finished because his flight decks had become parking lots. The Americans learned this lesson the hard way 6 months later at Midway. On June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were caught with their decks full, some planes being armed for a land strike, others being rearmed for a naval strike, recovered Zeros refueling. The deck cycle had them paralyzed for 47 minutes. That's when Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise arrived. 3 carriers destroyed in 5 minutes because they physically couldn't get planes airborne. The straight deck design had turned them into floating bombs. After Midway, both navies started tracking something they called deck cycle efficiency. Basically, how long a carrier was useless between strikes. The numbers were brutal. USS Yorktown's air group recorded an average of 93 minutes from last recovery to next launch during the Guadalcanal campaign in fall 1942. Saratoga logged 108 minutes during the Santa Cruz battle in October. The Japanese were worse. Shokaku needed 2 hours and 14 minutes to turn her deck around after recovering aircraft at the Eastern Solomons. Every admiral in the Pacific could see the problem. Carriers were spending more time shuffling aircraft than actually fighting. The Enterprise Air Group commander Wade McCluskey, the same guy who bombed 3 carriers at Midway, wrote a classified memo in January 1943 that basically said, "We're built for one-punch fights, but we're in a 15-round boxing match." He calculated that if Japanese and American carrier groups met in open ocean, whichever side launched first would probably win, because the other side would be trapped in recovery operations when the strike arrived. Naval warfare had devolved into quick-draw contests where the fastest gun won. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy had enough new Essex-class carriers that they could rotate them, some launching, some recovering, some rearming. It worked, sort of, but it meant you needed 3 carriers to do the job one carrier should have been able to handle. Commander Joseph Clifton, serving on Lexington in 1944, recorded in his log that during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, American carriers launched 226 aircraft but took 97 minutes to recover them all. 5 pilots ditched from fuel exhaustion, waiting for deck space. This wasn't sustainable. Something had to change, because the U.S. Navy was building bigger, faster carriers that could hold 80, then 90, then 100 aircraft. But if you couldn't actually use all those planes because your deck geometry was stuck in 1925, what was the point? While American carriers were slugging it out in the Pacific, the Royal Navy was quietly solving the deck cycle problem in the Atlantic, and nobody was paying attention. British carriers had a different nightmare than the Americans. Their flight decks were smaller, their hangars more cramped, and they were operating in the North Atlantic where weather could ground aircraft for days. Captain Matthew Slattery on HMS Illustrious realized in early 1943 that his ship would never match American carrier efficiency using conventional straight-deck operations. So he started experimenting with something that sounded insane. What if planes could land while other planes were still spotted forward on the deck? The initial tests in March 1943 were crude. Slattery had his deck crews paint a white line down the port side of the flight deck, basically creating a narrow landing strip that bypassed the parked aircraft. Pilots would approach from astern, catch the arresting wires on this offset path, then taxi into the pack. It worked exactly once before a sea fire came in too far right and clipped the tail of a parked swordfish. Back to the drawing board. But Slattery had proven something crucial. You didn't necessarily need the entire deck width for landing. Planes could theoretically touch down on one section while another section handled something else. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dennis Campbell, a civilian physicist working for the Royal Aircraft Establishment. In late 1943, Campbell was studying aircraft carrier efficiency for the Admiralty when he realized everyone was thinking about the problem wrong. Carriers treated the flight deck like a highway. One lane, one direction, everyone queuing up. But what if you thought of it like a railway junction? Trains could cross paths if the tracks intersected at an angle. Apply that to a carrier deck. Angle the landing area away from the launch area, and suddenly you had two operations happening simultaneously. Campbell's January 1944 proposal called for cutting the aft section of the flight deck at a 5-degree angle to port. Planes would land on this angled section, catch the wires, then taxi off to the portside deck park, while aircraft spotted on the starboard bow could launch without waiting. The Admiralty was skeptical, changing the fundamental geometry of every carrier in the fleet based on a physicist's napkin sketch seemed reckless. But they approved a trial on HMS Triumph, a light carrier operating in the Indian Ocean where combat intensity was lower. Commander H.P. Bramwell oversaw the modifications in Colombo Harbor in August 1944. Workers painted an angled landing strip on Triumph's deck. No structural changes, just paint and repositioned arresting wires. The first test pilot, Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown, later wrote that approaching the angled deck felt fundamentally wrong, like landing on a carrier that was turning beneath you. But it worked. Brown trapped, taxied left, and was clear of the landing area in 45 seconds. Meanwhile, a Corsair launched from the bow catapult. 2 operations, same moment, 0 interference. The Royal Navy quietly tested angled deck operations through late 1944 and into 1945. The results were remarkable, but limited. The 5-degree angle helped, but it wasn't enough to truly separate landing and launch operations. Planes still had to taxi through congested areas. The war ended before the British could refine the concept further, and with Japan defeated, carrier innovation suddenly wasn't a priority anymore. The research sat in Admiralty files gathering dust while the world demobilized. The solution was right there, proven in combat, and everyone just forgot about it. Enter Commander Walter Boone, a U.S. Navy test pilot who in 1951 was probably tired of hearing about how jets were going to make carriers obsolete. The new F-9F Panthers and F-2H Banshees were faster and heavier than propeller planes, which meant they needed more deck space to land and carried less fuel margin for error. Every aviation expert was saying the same thing. Jet aircraft and straight-deck carriers were incompatible. The Navy would have to build entirely new ships or accept that carriers were finished. Boone thought that was nonsense. He'd read the British reports on HMS Triumph's angled deck experiments mostly because nobody else had bothered to, and he saw what the Royal Navy had missed. The 5-degree angle wasn't enough. You needed the landing strip angled far enough that a plane missing all the arresting wires could simply throttle up and take off again without hitting anything. The British were thinking about traffic management. Boone was thinking about physics and failure modes. If you angled the deck 8 to 10 degrees, a bolter, a pilot missing the wires, could execute a touch-and-go, climb out, and come around for another attempt. No crash, no deck crew clearing wreckage, no 30 planes circling while you clean up a disaster. In March 1951, Boone pitched this to Rear Admiral Apollo Susek at the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland. Susek's response was basically, "Prove it." So Boone and his team grabbed USS Midway while she was in Norfolk for routine maintenance. They painted an angled landing area on her deck, 8 degrees offset to port, and repositioned the arresting gear. The geometric change was simple, but the implications were revolutionary. The angled deck created 2 separate runways on one ship, a straight catapult track from bow to stern for launches, and an angled landing strip from stern to portside midship for recoveries. For the first time in naval aviation history, you could land and launch simultaneously. The first test was July 1951. Boone himself flew the initial approach in an F-9F Panther, coming in at 145 knots toward what looked like a deck that was turning away from him. He caught the 3-wire perfect trap, taxied to the portside deck park. While he was still rolling, another Panther launched from the bow catapult. 30 seconds later, a third Panther trapped on the angled deck. Then, another launch. Recovery, launch, recovery, launch. The flight operations that used to take 90 minutes were suddenly happening in continuous flow. The test crew logged 12 landings and 12 launches in 18 minutes. That same evolution on a straight deck would have taken over an hour. But here's what really sold the concept. Boone deliberately bolted during the 7th approach, missing all 4 wires. On a straight deck, that's an emergency. You're about to plow into parked aircraft worth millions of dollars and probably kill people. On the angled deck, Boone just added throttle, lifted off, and climbed away clean. The deck crew didn't even flinch. He came around, trapped on the next pass. Suchek, watching from the island, immediately understood what he was seeing. The angled deck didn't just improve efficiency, it eliminated the deadliest failure mode in carrier aviation. The July tests proved the geometry worked. The August tests proved it worked with multiple aircraft types. By September 1951, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics was already drawing plans to retrofit every carrier in the fleet. One test pilot and a can of paint had just doubled American naval striking power. Proving the angled deck worked with paint on USS Midway's flight deck was one thing. Actually rebuilding carriers to make it permanent was an engineering nightmare that would consume 3 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, and force the Navy to rethink everything they knew about carrier construction. The problem wasn't just cutting the deck at an angle, it was that every system on a carrier had been designed around straight deck geometry for 30 years. Change one thing, and you had to change everything. First challenge, the island superstructure. On straight deck carriers, the island sat on the starboard side about midship, which was fine when your landing area ran straight down the center line. But with an 8-degree angled deck, recovering aircraft were now flying directly at the island before catching wires. The approach path crossed right where the island stood. Naval architects at New York Naval Shipyard spent 6 months in late 1951 calculating whether they could move islands, shrink islands, or somehow make islands transparent to aircraft. The solution they settled on was compromise. They'd shift the island slightly aft and add a deck extension on the port side to widen the angled landing area. It meant cutting into the hull structure and reinforcing frame members. Every carrier retrofit would require 4 months in dry dock just for structural work. Second challenge, the arresting gear itself. The hydraulic systems that stopped aircraft were engineered to run perpendicular to the ship's center line with wire machinery built into the deck structure. Angling everything 8 degrees meant redesigning the entire arresting system, rerouting hydraulic lines, and rebuilding the spaces below deck where the equipment lived. Grumman aircraft engineer Robert Decker calculated that each carrier retrofit would require removing and replacing roughly 40% of the arresting gear infrastructure. USS Antietam's conversion in 1952 consumed 11,000 man-hours just on arresting system work. Then there was the catapult problem, which turned into an opportunity. The Navy had been testing steam catapults, dramatically more powerful than the older hydraulic systems, and the angled deck retrofit was the perfect excuse to install them. Commander C.C. Kirkpatrick, overseeing Antietam's conversion, realized that steam catapults on the bow plus angled deck landing meant carriers could launch heavier aircraft while recovering heavier aircraft simultaneously. But steam catapult installation required cutting deck plates, running steam lines from the boilers, building catapult machinery rooms below deck. What started as a deck angle project became a complete flight deck reconstruction. The mirror landing system, the optical device that would guide pilots to the angled deck, presented its own headaches. British inventors had developed the system in 1952, using a gyro-stabilized mirror and lights to show pilots their glide slope. Installing it required precise calibration to the new 8-degree deck angle, and the mirror had to be positioned where pilots could see it during the offset approach. Lieutenant Commander J.R. Lanham, the test pilot evaluating the system on Antietam, crashed twice in early testing because the mirror placement gave false glide slope information. They had to move it 3 times before getting it right. Between 1952 and 1955, The Navy converted 13 Essex-class carriers to angled decks. Each conversion cost between $8 and $12 million, serious money when the ships themselves cost $70 million new. USS Bennington went into Norfolk Naval Shipyard in January 1954 and didn't emerge until September. USS Hornet's retrofit took 7 months. These weren't minor modifications. Workers were cutting away sections of original deck, welding in new structure, rerouting every major system. The ships that came out were fundamentally different from the ships that went in, even though they looked mostly the same from a distance. USS Antietam left Norfolk in December 1952 as the world's first operational angled deck carrier, and she was heading straight into combat in Korea to prove whether Boone's geometry worked under fire or was just another promising idea that would collapse when people started shooting. The Navy's leadership was split, half convinced this was the future of naval aviation, half certain it was an expensive modification that would get pilots killed. Antietam had 4 months to settle the argument. The ship arrived off the Korean coast in January 1953 and immediately started flying combat sorties against North Korean and Chinese positions. Commander William Cisco, the air boss, kept meticulous logs because he knew everyone back in Washington was watching. The first week of operations established baseline numbers. Antietam launched and recovered 68 sorties in a 12-hour period. That doesn't sound impressive until you compare it to her sister ship, USS Kearsarge, operating with a straight deck 50 miles south, which managed 39 sorties in the same time frame. Same air group size, same aircraft types, same mission profiles. The angled deck was generating 74% more combat power from the same ship. The real difference showed up in what pilots called deck availability, how much of the time the flight deck was actually ready to receive aircraft. On straight deck carriers in Korea, deck availability averaged 42%. That meant pilots launching for strikes knew they had a 50-50 chance the deck would be ready when they returned, and if it wasn't, they'd burn fuel circling or divert to an emergency field in South Korea. On Antietam, with the angled deck, availability jumped to 79%. Pilots could count on coming home. That sounds like a statistics game until you're the guy in the cockpit watching your fuel gauge. Lieutenant James Meichener, the future author, was flying F-9F Panthers off Antietam in February 1953 when he watched the angled deck save 3 lives in one afternoon. A Sky Raider returning from a close air support mission took battle damage and came in hot, way too fast, bolted through all 4 wires. On a straight deck, he's plowing into the deck pack, probably killing himself and destroying 2 or 3 parked aircraft. On Antietam's angled deck, he just flew off the port side, climbed out, dumped fuel to reduce weight, and trapped on the next pass. Same day, different emergency. F-9F, with hung ordnance, a bomb that wouldn't release, needed to land immediately because the arming wire had pulled and the bomb was live. Straight deck? No chance. Too dangerous with planes parked forward. Angled deck? Land him now, no problem. The landing area is clear. Third incident, pilot with spatial disorientation, came in way off centerline, touched down almost on the port deck edge. Would have crashed into the island on a straight deck. On the angled deck, he was actually close to being on glide, trapped normally. By March 1953, Cisco's logs showed Antietam was flying 89 sorties per day versus 47 for straight-deck carriers. The Navy sent Captain John Crommelin out to observe operations and report back. His cable to the Chief of Naval Operations was blunt. Angled deck increases striking power by minimum 85%. Every carrier not modified is fighting at half capacity. Recommend emergency conversion of all fleet carriers immediately. The skeptics in Washington shut up real fast. What sold everyone was a single metric the Navy started tracking in April, mission effectiveness cycles, which measured how many complete strike recovery, rearm, relaunch cycles a carrier could execute in 24 hours. Straight-deck carriers averaged 2.3 cycles. Antietam was logging 4.1 cycles. She was fighting like two carriers. The geometry that Boone had proven with paint in 1951 was now proven with blood and bombs in 1953. The combat results from Korea ended the debate, and by late 1953, the Navy committed to something bigger than just retrofitting old carriers. They were designing a completely new class built from the keel up around angled deck operations. The Forrestal-class supercarriers would be the first warships in history where the angled deck wasn't an afterthought modification, but the foundational design principle. Everything else, propulsion, armor, weapons, crew quarters, was engineered around maximizing what that 8-degree angle could deliver. USS Forrestal herself launched in December 1954, and the difference was obvious just looking at her from the pier. The angled landing area wasn't painted lines on a straight deck. It was integrated into the hull structure with reinforced deck plating along the angled section specifically rated for jet aircraft impacts. The island was positioned farther aft than any previous carrier, giving pilots an unobstructed approach to the angled deck. 4 steam catapults, 2 on the bow, 2 on the angled waist deck, meant Forrestal could launch 4 aircraft every 60 seconds while simultaneously recovering aircraft on the landing area. The theoretical maximum sortie rate was 170 aircraft per day. No carrier in World War II had managed more than 90. Captain Roy Johnson took Forrestal through shakedown operations in 1955, and the ship immediately validated every design decision. During one test evolution off the Virginia Capes in August, the Air Wing launched a 40-plane strike, recovered 32 aircraft from the previous mission, and launched another 20-plane combat air patrol, all within 47 minutes. The deck crew was running 3 separate operations simultaneously: catapult launches from the bow, arrested recoveries on the angled deck, and aircraft towing and fueling in the forward deck park. It was controlled chaos that somehow worked because the geometry kept everything separated. The strategic implications hit the Soviet Union like a hammer. Their naval planners had assumed American carriers were vulnerable during flight operations. Catch them while launching or recovering, and you could overwhelm them. The angled deck Forrestals destroyed that assumption. These carriers were never truly vulnerable because they were never truly stopped. Soviet Admiral Sergei Gorshkov wrote in a 1956 assessment that NATO carrier groups built around Forrestal-class ships could maintain continuous strike capability against Soviet positions. His conclusion was bleak. The Soviet surface navy had no effective counter to supercarriers that could launch 100 combat sorties per day indefinitely. The numbers backed up Gorshkov's fears. By 1959, the Navy had 4 Forrestal-class carriers operational: Forrestal, Saratoga, Ranger, and Independence. Each carried an air wing of 90 aircraft and could generate sustained sortie rates that matched 3 World War II carriers combined. During NATO exercises in 1960, Forrestal's air wing flew 147 sorties in 24 hours, including night operations. The kicker was aircraft availability. On straight-deck carriers, maintainers struggled to work on planes because the deck was constantly cycling between launch and recovery. On Forrestal, the forward deck park became a stable maintenance area where crews could actually fix aircraft while operations continued around them. The doctrinal shift this enabled was profound. Before angled decks, carrier groups stayed far from threats because they needed time and space to recover aircraft between strikes. Forrestal and her sisters could operate closer to enemies because they could defend themselves while attacking, launching fighters, while recovering strike aircraft, while fueling the next wave. Vice Admiral John McCain Jr. called it rolling thunder capability in a 1961 brief, and he meant it literally. The carrier became a platform for continuous, uninterrupted air power projection in a way that had never existed before. One innovation, one geometry change, had created a weapon system that would dominate naval warfare for the next 50 years. Walk onto any carrier deck today, Nimitz class, Ford class, doesn't matter, and you're standing on the same basic geometry that Boone painted on Midway in 1951. The 8-degree angled landing area is still there. The ball catapults are still positioned the same way. The optical landing system still sits port side of the angled deck. 74 years later, nobody's found a better solution because the solution was right the first time. That almost never happens in military technology. The USS Gerald R. Ford, commissioned in 2017 as the most advanced carrier ever built, cost $13 billion and includes electromagnetic catapults, advanced arresting gear, and a nuclear reactor that'll run for 50 years without refueling. But her flight deck? 8-degree angled landing area, same as Forrestal in 1955. The Ford can launch and recover 33% more sorties than Nimitz-class carriers, but that's not because someone reinvented the deck geometry. It's because electromagnetic catapults cycle faster and the crew needs less time between launches. The fundamental layout that enables simultaneous operations hasn't changed because it doesn't need to change. The physics still work. Modern carrier operations run on a tempo that would have seemed impossible to World War II admirals. During Operation Inherent Resolve against ISIS in 2016, USS Dwight D. Eisenhower maintained 75 sorties per day for 7 consecutive months. The Air Wing flew 12,000 combat missions without a single operational loss due to deck cycles or recovery problems. Pilots launched knowing the deck would be ready when they returned. Same confidence Antietam's pilots had over Korea in 1953. The angled deck eliminated an entire category of fear from carrier aviation. But here's what really demonstrates the innovation's staying power. Every other navy copied it. When China built the Liaoning and Shandong carriers, they included angled decks. India's INS Vikramaditya has an angled deck. Even the smaller amphibious assault ships like America-class and Queen Elizabeth-class, which use vertical landing jets that don't technically need angled decks, still incorporate the geometry because it improves deck flow and aircraft handling. The design principle transcended the specific problem it was meant to solve and became the universal standard for any ship operating fixed-wing aircraft. The innovation also outlasted the technology it was designed for. Boone was thinking about jet aircraft in 1951, but the angled deck works just as well for the F-35C fifth-generation stealth fighters operating today, or whatever unmanned combat aircraft the Navy fields in 2040. The geometry isn't tied to a specific aircraft type. It's tied to the fundamental physics of landing something with forward momentum on a moving platform. As long as carriers exist and aircraft need runways, you'll need the angled deck. There's something almost elegant about how a simple geometric change, 8 degrees of angle, solved a problem that admirals thought would require completely new ships or revolutionary technology. No exotic materials, no computers, no advanced engineering that only 3 countries can manufacture. Just rotate the landing area and suddenly everything works. Commander Boone probably didn't realize he was designing the standard layout for the next century of naval aviation. He was just trying to keep pilots alive and make carriers more useful. But that's often how the best innovations work. Solve the immediate problem really well, and you accidentally build something that lasts forever. Stand on a carrier deck in 2025, and you're standing on a piece of 1951 thinking that nobody's improved because nobody's needed to. The angled deck doubled carrier striking power, eliminated the deadliest failure mode in naval aviation, and created the platform for 70 years of American naval dominance. Not bad for some paint and geometry.